Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I wish to make a statement on the UK's response to recent Russian maritime activity. I'm glad the House has been waiting for this morning. Mr. Speaker, a foreign vessel, Yantar, is currently in the North Sea, having passed through British waters. Let me be clear. This is a Russian spy ship used for gathering intelligence and mapping the UK's critical underwater infrastructure. Yantar entered the UK exclusive economic zone about 45 miles off the British coast on Monday. For the last 2 days, the Royal Navy has deployed HMS Somerset and HMS Tyne to monitor the vessel every minute through our waters. And I changed the Royal Navy's rules of engagement so that our warships can get closer and better track the Yantar. So far, the ship has complied with international rules of navigation. But, Mr. Speaker, this is the second time that Yantar has entered our waters in recent months. In November, the ship was also closely watched and detected loitering over UK critical undersea infrastructure. To deter any potential threat, I took measured steps then as part of a clear direct response to the Russian vessel. RAF Maritime patrol aircraft, alongside HMS Catterstock, HMS Tyne, and RFA Proteus, were deployed to shadow Yantar's every movement. Today, I also wanted to confirm to the House that I authorised the Royal Navy submarine, strictly as a deterrent measure, to surface close to Yantar to make clear that we had been covertly monitoring its every move. The ship then left UK waters without further loitering and sailed down to the Mediterranean. As colleagues will understand, I won't comment further on reasons for operational security, but I want to thank all the personnel involved for their dedication and their professionalism. And I also want President Putin to hear this message. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we will not shy away from robust action to protect this country. And with our NATO allies, we're strengthening our response to ensure that Russian ships and aircraft cannot operate in secrecy near the UK or near NATO territory. Mr. Speaker, this is another example of growing Russian aggression, targeting our allies abroad and us at home. The heads of MI6 and the CIA recently stated together in a joint statement Russia is waging, they said, a reckless campaign of sabotage across Europe. We're seeing periodic incursions of Russian military aircraft into airspace for which we are responsible. And on Christmas Day, the S-Link 2 undersea cable between Finland and Estonia was damaged. Many analysts believe this was caused by a vessel in Russia's shadow fleet. Mr. Speaker, Russia is dangerous but fundamentally weak. In Ukraine, it has suffered devastatingly high rates of casualties over 3 years in a war that it thought it would win in a week. And compounding the humiliation, Putin has been forced to turn to North Korea to reinforce its frontline fighters. And while the strategic defeat in Syria, of course, has exposed its diminishing power on the global stage, and at home, the Russian economy faces crippling strains. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, Russia remains the most pressing and immediate threat to Britain. And I want to assure the House and the British people that any threat will be met with strength and resolve. First, we're delivering on the foundation of security in our plan for change by making Britain secure at home. Yantar has now passed through the Dover Strait and is in Dutch waters. In September, RAF Typhoon scrambled to intercept 2 Russian Bear F aircraft operating near the UK. And the Royal Fleet Auxiliary is also playing an indispensable role in safeguarding offshore infrastructure with its multi-role ocean surveillance ship, RFA Proteus. Second, we are making Britain strong abroad, working with NATO and Joint Expeditionary Force allies. The UK activated Nordic Warden with Jeff partners after the S-Link 2 cable damage. The operation is tracking potential threats to undersea infrastructure, monitoring the movements of the Russian Shadow Fleet, and sending out real-time warnings of suspicious activity to Jeff allies and to NATO. And today I can confirm that the RAF will provide P-8 Poseidon and Rivet Joint surveillance aircraft to join the new Baltic Sentry NATO deployment to protect critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. And third, Mr. Speaker, with allies we're piling on pressure on Putin. This year the UK will provide more financial aid in military support to Ukraine than at any time since the full-scale invasion began. 4.5 billion, delivering military support to enhance training and strengthen industrial collaboration. The UK is also leading ways to put pressure on the Russian economy, including sanctioning over 100 ships in the Russian Shadow Fleet, more than any other nation, working with other countries to stop Russian military acquiring the goods and the equipment and the technologies they require to continue their fight and war against Ukraine, and with allies exposing the activities of the Russian intelligence services, expelling Russian intelligence officers, and sanctioning individuals responsible for hostile activity against the UK. Mr. Speaker, Russian aggression will not be tolerated at home or in Ukraine. It's why one of the first acts of this government was for the Prime Minister to launch the Strategic Defence Review. It's why the government has increased defence spending next year by almost £3 billion. And why we'll set a path to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP in the spring. Mr. Speaker, this new era of threat demands a new era for defence. Change is essential, not optional, and the government is determined to meet the challenge, determined to deliver for defence. We will protect the homeland and our critical national infrastructure, and we will make Britain secure at home and strong abroad.
Secretary of State James Cott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for early sight of his statement. Particularly grateful to the Secretary of State for the greater level of transparency he has chosen to share with the House about the grey zone threat from Russia. We welcome that transparency because it is critical for our war readiness as a nation that, as far as we are able, and without compromising our national security and operational security, we tell the British public the truth about the serious nature of the Russian threat and what that will inevitably mean for public expenditure on defence. Now, I specifically welcome the change to the Royal Navy's rules of engagement. This sends a powerful signal to Putin that we will not be intimidated, and that if his aim is to keep pushing the boundaries of malign activity in our waters and those proximate to us, we will respond. And I can confirm that the government will have the full backing of His Majesty's opposition in doing so. We stand shoulder to shoulder with the government on Ukraine. We stand shoulder to shoulder with them on deterring the wider Russian threat that he has outlined today. Now, I appreciate it is unusual to go into such operational detail, including about the operational deployment of submarines. Equally, we appreciate that this is about sending the strongest possible signal to our adversaries about our clear intent to protect and defend our homeland. So, if I may, I have a number of specific questions about the statement and its particular contents. A key issue here is the safety and protection of critical undersea infrastructure. Beyond the operations the Secretary of State mentioned in his speech, such as Nordic Warden, will he confirm whether he is looking to widen the number of international partners proactively involved in addressing this threat to the North Sea and the Baltic, and what discussions is he having to drive an internationally coordinated response, including through NATO? Given our prominent role within NATO, we have a clear opportunity to lead the way in developing cutting-edge underwater technologies that address these threats directly. Can the Secretary of State confirm that he is prioritising development of underwater capabilities, such as uncrewed systems, through Pillar 2 of AUKUS, but also with European allies, and in particular that R&D investment into capabilities to protect critical infrastructure will be an urgent priority? Moreover, will he commit to do everything possible to hinder the abilities of GRU operatives, including all possible action in concert with allies to restrict their ability to enter the United Kingdom? Madam Deputy Speaker, I am very grateful to the personnel of our Navy, the RFA and our Air Force involved in addressing these threats, and I want to sincerely thank them as well as the crews of Allied vessels who assisted in tracking this ship through their waters. One particularly important point the Secretary of State said was that Russia is dangerous but fundamentally weak. Does he nevertheless agree that Russia's willingness to tolerate such enormous losses on the battlefield against Ukraine underlines that in conventional military terms it remains a formidable foe before one even considers its unconventional capabilities? In my view, Russia remains a critical threat to the United Kingdom. And for that reason, I very much welcome the Secretary of State's clear decision to be more open with the country about the threat we face. So can I urge him to ensure that from the heart of government we have a serious grip on communicating and planning for the fact we do face the most serious nation-on-nation military threat to our homeland for generations. In turn, this means that the SDR needs to be fundamentally threat-driven, prioritising homeland defence and putting the necessary resource in place. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a situation where we have seen the RFA, the Royal Navy, submarines, helicopters, P-8 aircraft and other assets involved in tracking Russian activity, does this not show the full extent of the work needed to defend our island and deter our adversaries, and ultimately why we need to increase defence spending as soon as possible? Finally, he said again in his statement, as he did at orals, and I welcome it, that the SDR will report in the spring. Can I urge him to ensure that this is in March at the very earliest opportunity, and that we will achieve at least 2.5% spending on defence this Parliament?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the Shadow Defence Secretary's welcome for this statement and for the Government's greater transparency. He, like I, has confirmed that he sees Russia as, in his words, the most critical threat to the UK. He's been a Defence Minister. He understands, as he acknowledges, the importance of sending the strongest possible signals to our adversaries, and that is the underlying reason for the decision I've taken to make this statement today. He asks about and argues that this is an opportunity for the UK to demonstrate leadership within NATO in response. I think we have already done that, not by asserting that argument, by the actions in launching and leading through the GEF 10 nations, the Nordic Warden response to the attack on the S-Link 2, and by now confirming that we will play a leading role in the new NATO deployment into the Baltic, which is linked to the work that we're doing through Nordic Warden. He asks about the priority for our undersea cables for our homeland infrastructure. These cables aren't simply a technical network. These are the infrastructure, the things that we depend on for our daily lives, the operation of the internet, the supply of energy, the communications with other parts of the world. He will therefore have seen and noted in the terms of reference of the Strategic Defence Review launched by the Prime Minister within 2 weeks of this government being elected in July, that defending and reinforcing the homeland defence of Britain is foremost in those terms of reference. And we will, as I've said, report on the Strategic Defence Review in the spring.
There are members bobbing in the chamber that weren't here at the start of the debate. We've made a note of all of those and the time they arrived, and they will not be called. If you don't know if that means you, speak to your whip. I call the Defence Select Committee Chair, Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, for advance sight of his statement. And in particular, it is very apt that he should be making this statement because during our Defence Committee visit to RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland last week, we were discussing this very issue. Clearly also there is a greater need for greater availability and capacity for Royal Navy and other maritime capability to meet the rising Russian activity in waters surrounding the UK. For example, the threats to critical undersea infrastructure. My two questions to the Secretary of State. Firstly, what lessons has the government learnt from the Finnish investigation into Eagle S, accused of damaging the undersea infrastructure between Finland and Estonia? And secondly, what measures are available to the government to stop vessels from traversing UK waters to build upon the recent insurance checks that were put in place in October? Is sanctioning vessels our only option?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Select Committee Chair, if I may, and the members of his committee for not just the work they're doing, but the work that they are willing to do outside this House. And I thank them for the visit that they paid to Lossiemouth to see for themselves some of the essential work that our forces personnel and civilians are playing in defending this country. He asks about the Finnish investigation into the S-Link 2 cable damage. That is for the Finns to complete and to confirm the findings of their investigation, and it'll be at that point that I think we can draw and discuss any lessons that there may be for the UK. And finally, we defend more fiercely than perhaps any other nation in the world the freedom of navigation in our seas, and the ships of all states may navigate through our territorial waters. They are subject to the right of innocent passage, and so some of the steps that he might wish upon the government and urge us to take are simply not available to us under the United Nations law of the open seas. And so it's for that reason that we take such steps and we take the actions that I've reported to the House in order to make sure that we monitor, we watch, we track, and that those who may enter our waters with malign intent or try to undertake any malign activity know that we see them and know that they will face the strongest possible response.
It's also important for the front bench to arrive on time to hear the opening statement, and I believe the Liberal Democrat spokesperson was 4 minutes late. And it's important to note that they may not be called in the future. But on this occasion, I do invite the Liberal Democrat spokesperson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and apologies for my lateness. Thank you, Minister, for the advance sight of the statement. It goes without saying that we stand shoulder to shoulder in our support with this government against the Russian threat, and we thank all those service personnel involved in dealing with this threat. The Lib Democrats believe our defence policy and conventional forces should be focused on defending British territory and playing a leading role in our immediate European neighbourhood. As such, we welcome the government's announcement that the Royal Air Force will provide P8, Poseidon and Rivet Joint Maritime Patrol and surveillance aircraft to join Baltic Sentry under NATO command. Action to defend the realm is particularly pressing in light of recent escalations of hybrid threats from Russia. The suspected sabotage of undersea cables, including the damage to S-Link 2 on Christmas Day, underscores the urgency of this moment. Such cables are the lifeblood of international connectivity and commerce, and any attack on them is an attack on the collective stability of Europe. The events involving the tanker Eagle S and its links to sanctioned entities supporting Putin's war machine are deeply alarming. This is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of aggression that demands robust and coordinated action. This government must rebuild trust with our European neighbours. The UK's national interest and security have always been inextricably tied to Europe's. From World War II through to the Cold War to the current war in Ukraine, our shared defence has been vital. To that end, we urge the government to work hand in glove with NATO countries to support Ukraine during the war and in rebuilding afterwards, including finding lawful ways to use the $300 billion of frozen Russian state assets as reparations. Sign a comprehensive security treaty with the European Union to strengthen collaborative defence, and collaborate on developing cutting-edge defence technologies and ensure interoperability with NATO allies to respond effectively in times of crisis. We also face serious national vulnerabilities. The UK lacks land-based anti-ballistic missile systems to protect critical national infrastructure, and questions remain about the ability to secure the Greenland UK gap. We welcome the government's commitment to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, but when will the government outline a clear timeline for achieving this? This is not the time for complacency. The threats are clear and the response must be decisive.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have some sympathy with the Honourable Lady. Perhaps she, like I, thought there may be more interest in this House in the operation of the Competition and Markets Authority than the length of the urgent question proved to be. And it may just be that I can run a little faster than her as a result. But Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Lady for her support for the UK contribution to the Baltic Sentry NATO operation. We play a leading role in NATO. We will play a leading role in this operation in the Baltic. It's reinforcing our allies, and by reinforcing our allies, we reinforce our own defences, and we strengthen collectively the deterrence we can as NATO nations offer to any future aggression and aggressive intent from President Putin. She urges us to work hand in glove with allies over the support for Ukraine, which is indeed what we are committed to do. It's why the Prime Minister was in Kyiv last week when he confirmed the record level of funding for this year to support military aid to Ukraine, and when he signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. Finally, he made the commitment that I think the Honourable Lady is looking for, which he said, whatever happens next, our job is to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position, both on the battlefield and at any negotiating table. And that's what I, as Defence Secretary, are determined to do for this country.
Blair McDougall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Putin and his autocratic friends mistake our freedom and openness for weakness, and so can I enthusiastically welcome the strength of the response to the Russian activity. He'll be aware of the reports in Newsweek in recent days about patents that have been filed in China for specific cable cutting technology for presumed military use by the Chinese. So I wonder if you can reassure the House, and as well as being active in deterring Putin, that he's also and that the government are also taking a similarly robust stance to any attempts to cut the cables from China.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can reassure the Honourable Gentleman that I am aware of what he cites. I am aware of the pace of development of many aspects of Chinese technology and equipment. Much of it may be for civilian use, but I can assure him also that we, with allies, are keeping a very close eye on what they're developing.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for the statement, the action he's taken, and also all the work our servicemen have been doing in terms of combating this threat. Obviously, the Yantar is a very well-known threat and has been for quite a long time, but Russia has been very capable of using private and commercial vessels in order to be able to map cables and look at actually undermining our security. The reality is we need more resources within our Royal Navy and our other services. What assurance can the Secretary of State give the House that actually the bid is being put together for Treasury to make sure that they properly resource him and our servicemen to do the job we're all so dependent on?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, our UK servicemen and women will appreciate his thanks in the House today. I can give him that assurance, and most important, I can give him the commitment that we made to the British people at the election, that we're a government that will increase defence spending, will increase it to 2.5% of GDP, and that, of course, is a level that Britain has not spent on defence since 2010.
Michelle Scroggin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Over recent years, we've seen a large increase in Russian activity of this type, and it's clear that the need for subsurface protection is both critical and increasing. The UK subfleet is built at BAE Systems in my constituency, and we play a vital role in countering this threat. Would my right honourable friend comment on the support that this government is providing and will continue to provide to ensure that the submarine fleet continues to play this central role in the defence of our nation?
I can indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and she, like I, intensely proud of everything that is done, designed and developed at the Barrow shipyard. It is central to our UK security and has been for decades, and she'll be proud, like I, that the Royal Navy submarine that surfaced close to the Yantar in November, that led then to the Yantar heading directly off to the Mediterranean, was of course built in that Barrow shipyard.
Dame Caroline Dinage.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State agrees with me that our Royal Navy and our FA are the best in the world. Yeah. They need to be equipped with the vessels and the crew to do their job and address the threats like those he's just articulated, and I'm grateful for him for doing so today. He'll know that Portsmouth Harbour, on which Gosport sits on the opposite side, is home to the 6 Type 45s that were commissioned without adequate propulsion units. Could he update us on the T45 power improvement programme? Will it be sufficient for them to be allowed to deploy with the upcoming carrier strike group? And more broadly, what's he doing as part of the SDR to ensure that there's a significant and sufficient proportion of our naval personnel with seagoing liability?
Good question. If I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all to say to the Honourable Lady, I am so pleased that she cites alongside the Royal Navy the essential role of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. They play an essential part in our maritime defence and operations. Second, she asks for an assurance on the Type 45's participation in the carrier strike. I give her that. And if she'd like me to write to her in more detail about the progress with the engine upgrade programme, I'm happy also to do that.
Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for such a strong statement, and indeed one which makes very clear to Vladimir Putin that this aggression will not be tolerated. Recently, the Minister was kind enough to answer a series of written questions from me on myself on QRA, subsea cables and defence of the High North, all pointing to additional threats from Russian forces and the need for a strong response. With the Strategic Defence Review well underway, how is he ensuring that it is flexible in dealing with these changing and evolving threats to make sure we're also taking lessons that learning from Ukraine and from the recent example of the Finnish ship in the Baltic Sea?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is one of the strongest voices for recognising the way that the High North will become strategically much more essential, where degrees of conflict and contest are likely to grow, particularly as climate change leads to the opening up of the Northern Passage. I just say to him quite simply that if he looks at the terms of reference of the strategic review, if he looks at the work of the review and challenge groups that have been an essential part of that external leadership of this defence review, he will see that the concerns that he raises within the House today are absolutely central to the work of the Strategic Defence Review, and when it is published, I'm sure he will find the evidence of the sort of caution that he gives to the House taken very seriously by the government.
Alistair Common.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The activities of the Yantar may be an escalation, but this is not the first instance of activity of this sort. It's almost 2 years now since I first raised concerns about the activities of Russian vessels in the waters around Shetland. Events in Finland at Christmas show that Russia is prepared to go further, and we must also show that we are determined to meet any challenge of that sort. This is a strategic threat for the United Kingdom as a whole, but it is particularly acute for our island communities that rely on cables for digital and energy connectivity, quite apart from the pipeline serving the oil and gas industry. So will he speak to the energy companies and to his colleagues in the Department for Energy and Energy Security and ensure that our island communities are not left as the soft target for the next escalation in this business?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he's certainly right. This is not the first instance. And indeed, the total loss of digital connection that the Shetland and his constituency suffered in 2022 demonstrated most vividly both the daily life and everyday life dependency on this critical infrastructure and how vulnerable they can be to damage or sabotage. And so I give the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman, the assurance he's seeking in the consideration of the Strategic Defence Review and certainly in the implementation. That is exactly the sort of question that will be and the challenge that we'll be meeting.
Mark Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for his clear statement today? In addition to that, I also want to thank him for spelling out why it's so important that we protect these deep-sea cables. Something like 95% of all international data goes through these cables. It is the backbone of the internet. So given these facts, can the Secretary of State assure us that the protection of this critical infrastructure will be at the forefront of the minds of everybody completing the Strategic Defence Review?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he makes a powerful case. I can certainly give him that assurance.
Alex Shalbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I first of all welcome the Secretary of State with his candour. It is absolutely important that the country understands the threats that the nation is under, because estimates are that the economy will lose tens of millions of pounds per hour if there was a data loss, and these cables are absolutely strategic to our national well-being. With that in mind, may I urge the Secretary of State that the government has to explain to the public why we have to keep increasing defence spending in relation to what the consequences would be if it wasn't there. And if that does mean that we move above 2.5% to 3%, 3.5%, that it's not an issue about President Trump pushing that narrative, as many presidents have done before his time, is because that is the strategic requirement that Europe and NATO are going to need to head off what is clearly acts of aggression close to a declaration of hybrid war on NATO, and therefore be absolutely vital that the public understand why defence spending is so important at this time.
Very good. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman is a leading member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He understands better than most in this House the concerns and perspectives of other NATO nations, and he portrays that this morning. On the question of the commitment to increase defence spending, everyone agrees defence spending must rise. The commitment that my party made going into the election well predated the result of the US election. It's a commitment that we're determined to honour. And if it is the case that everyone agrees that defence spending must rise to meet the increasing threats, then there is certainly a lead responsibility for government and government ministers to help explain that to the public. But I would hope that everyone who believes that defence spending must rise can and will play a part in conveying that to the public as well.
Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker, although out of sight, our offshore infrastructure is absolutely vital to the smooth running of this economy, and any disruption to that would have a huge impact on my constituents in North East Derbyshire. It would be truly catastrophic. Can the Secretary of State assure me, therefore, we will not take the security of this infrastructure for granted, and that we'll make sure that we take the necessary steps to provide that security as part of the SDR?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome very much my honourable friend's voice from landlocked North East Derbyshire, recognising the fact that this is not simply a concern of maritime communities or islands, but of the whole country, and for all of us in our everyday lives. And I just refer, if I may, to the terms of reference of the Strategic Defence Review, which high up and with specific focus points to the need to review and reinforce the defence of our British homeland, and central to that, in light of our experience in recent months, in light of the rising Russian aggression, the increase in these sort of incidents, that is what the SDR will consider.
Sir Benedict.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his profoundly important statement, which is immensely reassuring. But can I ask about preemption? We all know that Russia is no respecter of international law, and an overzealous and overcautious interpretation of the legal constraints on the UK armed forces could be very destructive. Is the government refusing to rule out preemptive action against a hostile ship threatening critical national infrastructure, albeit if it lies under international waters? And will he agree that an open mind on preemption is a stronger deterrent than ruling it out?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman has a huge experience in this field, so he'll recognise that I simply won't and can't get into responding to hypotheticals. He urges me not to allow undue constraint of perhaps established practices or rules where there is a good case for flexibility, and I hope he will take as a signal of the serious intent that I will bring to this my decision, as I've reported, with the approach of the return of the Yantar to UK waters, my readiness to alter the permissions that the Royal Navy was using, in order that should the captain of the warships we deployed to watch and track the Yantar required, they could go closer, they could see better, and they could determine more carefully what exactly the Yantar was up to. And of course, that was a move like the surfacing of the submarine in November, specifically to deter and to discourage the sort of activity that we simply don't want to see in our waters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Keeping ourselves safer at home means ensuring that Putin will lose abroad, because when Putin is finished in Ukraine, whenever that may be, he will come for more. And defeating him means showing him we have the resolve and the resources to defeat him in the future. Can the Secretary of State assure me that as part of the SDR we will have a way to combat and indeed prevent and protect ourselves from Russia?
I hope my honourable friend will take the content of my statement, the assertion that the most immediate and concerning threat to the UK it comes from Russia. I hope he'll take the action that I've taken in response to the Russian spy ship, the Yantar, in our waters again, will reassure him that exactly as he urges and the Shadow Defence Secretary has recognised, Russia is a serious menace. It's fighting a war in Ukraine, the first war, full-scale war in Europe since the Second World War, but its aggression, particularly as the Shadow Defence Secretary said, in the grey zone, warned about by the heads of the CIA and the MI6, tells us that this is a regime which is intent on disruption, it's intent of disrupting our way of life, and he is right to start by saying the defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. If Putin prevails in Ukraine, he simply will not stop in Ukraine.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the actions in it that he details to intervene in Russian activity in the waters around these islands. I also commend the diligence and professionalism of those men and women in uniform in the Royal Navy, Royal Fleet Auxiliary and the RAF. He says in his statement, though, that the UK will continue to lead the way on sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet. But the UK isn't leading the way on sanctions, is it? A Sky News investigation last week found out that the government has no record of how many investigations it's carrying out on breaches of Russian sanctions. And this follows a previous investigation which shows the flow of goods, including luxury cars, fossil fuels and items which can be or have the components converted into weaponry, is flowing between the UK and Russia since the beginning of Russia's war in Ukraine. So surely the Secretary of State must be concerned that inaction elsewhere in Whitehall is potentially putting men and women in uniform in the UK's armed forces at risk from Russia's malign aggression.
Well, I certainly don't share the honourable gentleman's assertion about that. And I would simply say to him, I made the argument to him that the UK is leading the way with allies in action to deal with the Russian shadow fleet. And I confirmed to him that we have sanctioned 100 ships that are composed of that loosely networked Russian shadow fleet. And that number is more than any other nation.
Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement about Russia's activities, which is concerning but of course not surprising. I'm the chair of the APG for the Nordics, and would you agree with me in the importance of close cooperation with our Nordic allies in dealing with this threat? I'm building on the Shadow Secretary of State's comments and broader discussion about transparency and information sharing with the United Kingdom. Before Christmas last year, every Swedish household received the regular pamphlet om krisen eller kriget kommer, so if crisis or war comes. They do this regularly. Is it time for us to look into this?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman is, and I thank him for the work he does in chairing the all-party Nordic group in this House. I say to him, one of the benefits of all Nordic countries now being part of NATO, of the very close defence and security relationships we have with those countries, is that we can indeed learn from each other. And the not just the new before Christmas approach that the Swedish have taken to the sense that a country is stronger if its society is resilient and its society is recognising that they may be under threat and ready to respond if required. I think there are certainly some lessons for us in the UK as we consider the future and we consider a rising level and complexity of threats that we may face in the years ahead.
Last week, alongside other honourable members and peers in the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I visited the nation's flagship, the Prince of Wales aircraft carrier. Their commanding officer, Captain Will Blackett, and his team showed us the ship's capability, and we witnessed an incredible demonstration of how they can respond. But when we asked about how they would respond to ballistic missiles, or how this place and other institutions are protected from hostile states, it was a terrifying response, to be fair. Now, I realise, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Strategic Defence Review is ongoing and there's a commitment to get to 2.5%. But with President Trump threatening to pull out of NATO, this isn't enough. What plans does he have to go faster and to put our military retention and recruitment on a stronger footing so our country and our infrastructure is properly protected?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, Captain Blackett and his crew were delighted that the Honourable Lady and other members of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme were able to go on board, to be briefed and to look at what an extraordinary piece of British military kit we have. I just would say to us simply that the Strategic Defence Review is set up to examine exactly the sort of points that she raises. It's designed to look at the threats we may face, the capabilities we may need, and the resources available, but in particular, the accelerating way that the nature of warfare is changing, and the central role that an accelerating development of technology is changing both the nature of the threat and the nature of the capabilities that we must develop with allies in order to meet that.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If Putin's Russia is the greatest threat to peace in Europe, the second greatest threat must be any American decision to turn its back on NATO. So can the Secretary of State assure us that he will be doing everything in his power to convince his new counterparts in the United States administration of the seriousness of the threat that Russia poses?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't expect the new administration to require any coaching on the threats from Russia or the threats from and around other parts of the world. I expect this administration to be one that takes defence and security seriously and that recognises that a secure, free, openly trading Europe is in America's very best interests.
Robin Swan.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's statement says that the response is to strengthen our response to ensure Russian ships cannot operate in secrecy near UK territory. The Secretary of State will be aware of an occasion just over a year ago when a Russian submarine was actually chased from the harbour in Cork by the British Navy because the Irish Navy doesn't have the sonar equipment to detect those potential underwater threats. Those threats for about that 97% of the world's communication internet traffic. Can I ask the Secretary of State what communication or interaction he's had with the Irish Government and indeed the Irish Armed Forces in regards to strengthening our cooperation with them to ensure that the west coast of these British Isles are protected?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we don't and we won't comment on specific operational details like that. Needless to say, however, that we work very closely with the Irish Government on such matters, and recently our Chief of the Defence Staff met his counterpart from Ireland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Defence Secretary for his statement and for the actions that he has taken, in particular changing the rules of engagement to allow for the closer inspection of this vessel. But he doesn't control all the maritime assets of this country. In December, the Transport Secretary told me that there had been no instances in which this UK has used its agencies to board and inspect bits of the Russian black and grey fleet. None. Zero. Will he speak to his colleagues across government to ensure that we use all the arms of government and its agencies to interdict these unlicensed, unregistered threats to our security?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, where there are grounds for interdiction, then the government collectively, with whatever is the appropriate agency, will certainly be ready to take action, and he will know, having served as a distinguished Defence Minister for some years, that this sort of close coordination and collective action is a feature of the National Security Secretariat that we have at the very heart of our government. It plays and ensures that we can deal with any such threats, any such aggressive activity in the most appropriate way.
Mike Martin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Defence Secretary and his team and the service personnel involved for the robust response. This is exactly the kind of thing we need when dealing with Russia. The Defence Secretary is also right when he says that the Russian army in Ukraine has been nearly destroyed. But of course the Russian Navy, and particularly the Northern Fleet, which we have to deal with in the UK, is still at strength. So the Defence Secretary has just said a couple of times that Russia is the most pressing and immediate threat to the UK. So in light of these facts, does he still think it's the right decision to send the UK carrier group, which is most of the deployable Royal Navy due to the Royal Navy's size, to the Far East this year for 5 months?
Yes.
John Cooper.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. Undersea cables in the modern era are as vital to this country as the Merchant Navy convoys were in the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942, and they're also equally as vulnerable. Taking shape on the banks of the Clyde at the moment are the Type 26 frigates. They are state-of-the-art. They also have on board them so-called mission bays. We have heard that the Right Honourable Gentleman is fleet of foot and an excellent winner of a foot race today, but we are in an underwater arms race. Can he assure us that he'll do all he can to make sure that those mission bays bristle when the ships take to sea with the necessary underwater equipment to take on this threat?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that is exactly what those interchangeable bays are designed to be and to do and will.
Jim Alistair.
It's very clear that Putin is testing the resolve of the West, and I welcome the rigour of the statement from the Secretary of State today. But the threat to our underground cables is an international issue. Does the Secretary of State agree that the response of the United Nations has been disappointing, and that their Convention on the Law of the Seas is wholly inadequate and indeed out of date in terms of dealing with subversion such as this? And what steps, therefore, are being taken on an international level to get concerted action to protect the underground cables upon which every nation depends?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the problem is less with the basic rules of the sea and more with their observance by states that willfully will test the limits or contravene them. And that is why I think the action that I've been able to report to the House in the instance of the Yantar in British waters is exactly the sort of action and the steps that nations like the UK, working with allies, particularly close NATO allies, will continue to take.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for his statement. Nobody could doubt whatever the strength of his words and what it means for us as a United Kingdom to stand firm, and we thank him for that determination and that strong voice that we all support in this chamber. With our naval crew on HMS Somerset being called back on their ship on Christmas Day, the message was clear. The Russians don't take a holiday, but neither do our crews in the Royal Navy. The fact is that the perpetual activity and pressing towards the boundaries by Russia outlines our need for complete preparedness of our Navy. Will the Secretary of State outline whether greater support is needed to ensure that our Navy is at full strength when we consider the fact that our surface fleet is now smaller than that of both France and Italy?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman, and I know the service personnel, not just the crew of the HMS Somerset that, as he quite rightly said, were mobilised on Christmas Day to respond to the Estlink 2 damage, but the 10,000 servicemen and women who were deployed away from home at Christmas. We're grateful for their service. We know they do it to keep the rest of us safe, and we're very grateful.
That concludes that statement. I'll give the Secretary of State a moment so he can walk out and not run out, as earlier on. Martin, before you leave the chamber, you just walked in front of the dispatch box. So I suggest you come round and explain yourself.